She sensed something wasn't right, but didn't know what it was. She left the shadows cast by the church and crept quietly into the cemetery that stretched behind it. The graves were surrounded by neglected shrubs and trees, reminders of a once beautiful location that had since fallen into disrepair, just like the rest of East Berlin. Many of the graves were old, the tombstones worn, separated by dirt walking paths spaced evenly between them. Kirsten stepped cautiously, moving from one tombstone to the next, and was halfway across the cemetery before she saw them, silhouettes at first, and then more distinct as she got closer. Several East German soldiers, spaced 4 or 5 yards apart, stood at the edge of the cemetery. Others were huddled in pairs, whispering, and she saw the faint flicker of a cigarette held in a soldier's hand before he moved it to his mouth. Their gray uniforms were barely visible, blending with the darkness. She studied the string of soldiers, stretching like a ribbon in both directions, and knew something was drastically wrong. In the distance, 30 feet from where the soldiers stood, was a simple stone wall, barely 3 feet high, that marked the edge of the graveyard. The old wall, and 20 or 30 feet of graves adjacent to it, was located in West Berlin. She only had to get to it, scale it, and she was free, fading into the west like thousands of others had done before her. But tonight it was different. Tonight a line of soldiers stood on the border, waiting in the darkness. But waiting for what? Germany had been divided since the end of the Second World War, Communist East Germany and Free West Germany. The city of Berlin was also divided, the Communist East administered by the Russians, and the Free West governed by the French, British, and Americans. Kirsten lived in East Berlin, in the Russian half, but her grandmother lived in West Berlin, in the French section. Residents had always moved freely between the sectors, even though many went to the West and never returned. It never seemed to matter before, but she realized with a sinking feeling that maybe it mattered now. She heard the hum of machinery, distant at first, but growing louder. She peeked from behind a mausoleum, wondering what was happening. The noise came closer, an engine, a truck, or some sort of vehicle. She paused, eyeing the short stone wall only 60 feet away, but guarded by soldiers standing before it. Should she risk escaping, running through the cemetery past the soldiers and leaping over the wall, hoping they couldn't catch her? Before she could act, the noise came closer and the border was bathed in light. A searchlight sat in the rear of a truck parked along the edge of the graveyard. It cast a bright light along the wall directly in Kirsten's path. She crouched, hidden as men in workers' clothes and more soldiers exited the vehicle. Disillusioned and frightened, she retreated, hiding behind shrubs and tombstones, slipping through the shadows on her way back home,